May the words of my heart, may the words of my mouth and the inspiration of my heart be to your service, O God. Amen. So, do you get the Living Lutheran? Anybody still get it? So we had a really interesting column from the presiding bishop. I often don't read it, and I happened to read it this time, and I was a little surprised. So I'm going to read you a little passage from this. She starts out talking about Luther's discovery of his, the sort of the basic Reformation insight. The basic, is that going to work? Closer up? Okay, we good? Thanks. So Luther's basic insight that we are redeemed by God's mercy alone. So she writes, "This is a treasure, and it's the church's unique and proper work to preach the gospel purely and to administer the sacraments according to the gospel." And now she quotes the Augsburg Confession. "It's also taught that at all times there must be and remain one holy Christian church. It's the assembly of all believers, among whom the gospel is purely preached and the holy sacraments are administered according to the gospel." And then she writes again, "The church of which we are a part is the only institution on earth given this task." She goes on. The Augsburg Confession gives a clear explanation of the gospel, and again she quotes the confession. "Likewise, they teach that human beings cannot be justified before God by their own powers, merits, or works, but they are justified as a gift on account of Christ through faith." That's Article 4. Then she writes, "I'm concerned," and this is what was startling, "I'm concerned that the Lutheran understanding of the word being both law and gospel, and that there is a distinction between law and gospel, is getting blurred. Some define the gospel as social justice, feeding the hungry, standing with the poor and marginalized, racial equity, justice for migrants, respect for the dignity of all people. These are all vitally important ministries in which the church must be engaged. But they aren't the gospel. Rather, these works of justice and mercy flow from the liberation the gospel brings." That's strong stuff from a bishop, a presiding bishop of the ELCA these days. Is it going to work if I move around? Okay. That's strong stuff. She recognizes something that makes some people anxious. And I was actually kind of heartened to see the column because, to be honest, I worry. I fear that the ELCA will fall victim to the Americanization of the evangelical faith. That evangelical faith, that by faith alone, Christ's faith, the old Adam and the old Eve are put down. I fear that we'll fall into the habit of believing that our deeds will make ourselves and the world righteous. And it's nice on an RIC Sunday to remember this and to have before us a text that helps us see it afresh. Good choice of texts. It's nice lest we turn the salutary and good effort of being an RIC congregation into what it should be, home to all God's people, no matter who they are, lest we turn that into our works of righteousness and not God's. So let me explain by walking us through the text that works so well in helping us remember the line between the law and gospel. It's the story of Moses' auspicious birth and infanthood, the threat to his very existence and his deliverance by surprising means. It needs to be understood in its wider narrative and historical context. So let's start with that historical context, the world of the storyteller and her audience. I'm going to stick with her audience. Some people believe, I think maybe whimsically, but it's possible that the author of this particular narrative arc might have been a woman. So we'll stick with that for the fun of it today. Her audience was the community of Judeans who'd been deported to Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE. They were God's chosen people who were certainly wondering just what chosen meant when God abandoned you to the fate of defeat, capture, and exile to a strange and foreign land. Our author's colleague in exile had already rendered his answer to the question. In the narrative arc that runs from Deuteronomy to 2 Kings, his answer was to look at the people's past and show that in Deuteronomy, through Moses, God told the people before they entered the promised land that they were indeed chosen unilaterally, but that to remain in God's favor, they had to follow the laws. And in fact, just a few would do, honoring God above all else in the way that God required. Now, our author's colleague, who writes this narrative arc from Deuteronomy to 2 Kings, then told the story of the people's failure to honor even this much of their end of the bargain, and how God's judgment on them was, in time, exile from the land. As for getting back in God's good graces, according to this author, it was a matter of returning to the Lord in obedience, pleasing God by keeping the law even so minimally as to do so to identify yourself as God's people. Our author, the storyteller who gives us today's first lesson, was having none of it. Her understanding, too, was that God chose Israel unilaterally, but that God never imposed any obligations on God's people, but only on God's self, to be their God, to bless them even unto death. God's own death, if necessary. Parts of her story make that point. We can't go to them now. So her explanation of the exile was this. It was the result of Israel's own deeds, the logical consequences of rejecting the almighty protection God provides in favor of trusting in earthly rulers like the pharaohs and the emperors and the kings of the 8th, the 7th, and the 6th centuries BCE ancient Near Eastern world. It's the result, she said, of rejecting the loving embrace of God that asks nothing of you in exchange for your life, but companionship and affection, nothing more, in favor of the demanding lordship of rulers who give the bare minimum in exchange for your entire loyalty, your wealth, your household, your very being. It means rejecting dependence on a God who seeks only to extract from you affection and companionship in favor of someone who will give you the bare minimum in exchange for your all. It was, in terms we might use from the bishop's column that I started with, choosing law over gospel. Choosing at least the illusion that they were in control of their own fate, and that at the expense of alienating themselves from their God. And so they did, says our author. The story of the ancestors, Genesis 12 to 50, is one long story of men and women who are confronted with a God who only wants to love them, but turn aside from that embrace to do it on their own. Like the toddler feeling her way, they said time and again, I do it myself. Abraham gave Sarah away to Pharaoh, afraid that Pharaoh would kill him for his wife's beauty, not trusting in God's protection. And he did it again with Sarah to Abimelech, and his son Isaac did it with Rebekah to the same Abimelech. Sarah didn't trust the revelation from God that the rumbling in her womb meant that the younger, the second twin out, would rule over the first one, breaking the law of primogeniture. And so she bullied weak and wimpy Jacob into stealing the birthright belonging to Esau from Isaac with trickery. And Jacob, for his part, he went along willingly, hesitating only out of fear, not from some sense of honor. And so on goes the story, including the coup de grace, right? Joseph, God's chosen, playing in his own way the role of the self-reliant, arrogant jerk, and his brothers playing the role of the subjugated who behind their simpering plot and plan to take down the privileged. All of them forgetting God's election, so much so that God's name all but disappears from the Joseph story. And so there they were, in the equivalent of exile. That's the not-so-subtle point our author makes to contradict her colleague. It's not that God's chosen failed to keep the law so much as an even more fundamental flaw. They chose consciously to alienate themselves from the God who would make them God's own unilaterally, opting instead to make their own way on their own, to make their own identity in the world, even if it meant owing pharaohs, emperors, and kings their very lives and losing the land God gave them. Reconciliation in this author's book, then, was sorely needed. God's people had estranged themselves from God to preserve their control over their fate, and it had proved to be an illusion. They had traded the love of God for the yoke of the emperor of Babylon, a bad bargain if ever there were one, unless they think that the relatively good conditions they enjoyed in Babylon over against the at times tough life they had in Canaan was hardly a yoked existence, that like Joseph, his brothers, and their families in Egypt, they were all destined to be fat and happy in their exile from their promised land. Our storyteller reminds us in the chapter before today's what happens when you put your trust in your own wiles and temporal powers instead of God's grace and election. Jacob's descendants in the land of Pharaoh were enslaved, lost, so it seemed, entirely to the God who had elected them. Their estrangement from the God who chose them was complete. And so finally, we come to today's story, the birth of Moses and his amazing beginning. It helps to understand that in the Babylonian storytelling world of our storyteller and her audience, there were other origin narratives, like the big one our author writes in Genesis, Exodus, and Numbers, notably as a prelude to her colleague's narrative. Mine's older, mine's better, she says. These other stories included the ones Babylonians told about themselves and their forebears to explain their own identity and their own purpose in the world. And among their stories was the story of the birth of Sargon, the greatest king of their entire history, the first emperor in their memory, the king of kings, the one to whom every Babylonian emperor compared himself. Now let me read you the story of his birth. Sargon, strong king, king of a god am I. My mother was a high priestess. My father I do not know. My paternal kin inhabit the mountain region. My city of birth is Azupiranu, which lies on the bank of the Euphrates. My mother, a high priestess, conceived me. In the secret she bore me. She placed me in a reed basket with bitumen. She caulked my hatch. She abandoned me to the river from which I could not escape. The river carried me along to Aki, the water drawer. It brought me. Aki, the water drawer, when immersing his bucket, lifted me up. Aki, the water drawer, raised me as his adopted son. Aki, the water drawer, set me to his garden work. During my garden work, Ishtar, the goddess, loved me so that 55 years I ruled as king. You get the parallel, right? And there's no need to dwell on the finer points of the legend that's being borrowed here. Moses had a birth and early life as auspicious as Sargon. No, even more so, in fact, because Sargon, like the toddler, tries to own it for himself. Sargon, strong king of Akkad, am I. But Moses can't own this story because his story is God's story. It's God's story of gradually, ever so gingerly, ever so tentatively reconciling God's self to God's chosen people. They estranged themselves and languished in their estrangement, but God, who swore by God's own life to bless them, had to make God's way back to them, to reconcile God's self to them. It was, says our author, God's work then in Egypt, and it would be again, she declares, in Babylon. And she was right, wasn't she? As she tells the rest of her story, the story of God's reconciliation to us, broken and unrepentant creation that we are, didn't end there. She goes on to say that in the contest between Moses and Pharaoh, the journey through the sea, the wandering in the wilderness, the estrangements and reconciliations there, and so on, God ever so gingerly reconciled God's self to us. And you know the best part of the story best, right? So it went, until God finally chose to complete the story in Jesus, who suffered, died, and was raised. It was God's moment to say to all creation, you will not escape my embrace. You will be reconciled to me. And now we live with the Spirit of Christ among us, the advocate sent by God as heard in today's gospel. The animating power of God calling us time and again from our self-alienation from God back into God's embrace. In the water of baptism, in the bread and wine of Eucharist, in the word spoken and preached. The work of reconciliation, as it turns out, is God's work even now. So you might have noticed my use of the first person plural at the beginning. We, us, rather than the second person plural in addressing you in the beginning of the sermon. I set out to remind us, not you. I expressed my worry that we would turn the righteousness that God creates into us into our self-righteousness. Why? Because, and surely now you get the point, we, you and I, we are one and the same. One body, one old Adam, one old Eve, made new together by God, reconciling God's self to us. I can stand here and speak the words, but I'm nothing more than a vehicle for the word that God speaks. Nothing more than the vessel God uses to continue to do the work of reconciling God's self to me and to you, to all creation. So now, let's think about this and its implications for observing RIC Sunday, celebrating the fact that we're an RIC congregation. Back to the bishop's column. Let's be clear. The work we have set for ourselves in being an RIC congregation is right and salutary. And if it's done, forgetful of the law and the gospel distinction we live in and through, as Lutheran Christians, we run the risk of turning God's work of reconciliation into what we think is our own work. To falling into the trap the bishop worries about, to falling victim to the Americanization of the evangelical faith that I fear. In short, we can't fall into thinking of it as an act of righteousness. And that is all too easy for us, right? Because we are saints and sinners at the same moment, reconciled as saints by God to God, but always, like the ancient people, leaning into self-assertion because we remain sinners even as we are saints. We have to remember that we are merely the vessel of God's reconciling act, and that our invitation to others that we might think are different from us into God's embrace is merely living more fully into the new life we are called to by God's self-reconciliation to us. Living more fully into the oneness we all share with all people through God's acts of creation and reconciliation. And so let me suggest something radical. Rather than make it an act of recognizing, articulating, and celebrating differences in each person, make it an act of recognizing, articulating, and celebrating our oneness in the thing we all share in common. Once alienated from God, now reconciled. That's who we are, one and all, individuals and community together. That's who we have been called to be since Jesus spoke the words of institution to his disciples to this very moment and on into the future so long as God chooses. Let's remember that the gifts we bring in our difference are God's gifts to us through the work of the Spirit, determined and enlivened, as Paul says, by God in us. Not by you, not by me, but by God. We're the vessel. Just like as the preacher, I'm nothing more than the instrument by which God speaks, we are merely the means by which God reconciles God's self to the world. God makes use of us, one whole of many parts, to welcome and reconcile all creation in all of its difference. So let me close by inviting you to the table where God continues that work through bread and wine, the body and blood of Jesus. I want to do so by leaving you with an image I have the good luck to hold in my memory and revive time and again when I lean toward blurring the line between law and gospel and thinking that by my difference I might do something more than reflect to the world God's self-reconciliation to me and all creation. When I was a seminarian in Chicago's South Side in Hyde Park near the University of Chicago, I served as a student at Augustana Lutheran on South Woodlawn and 55th. If any of you know Chicago, you know the area. It was in those days a very diverse neighborhood, home both to poor and destitute people, many of whom had found their way there after the state of Illinois deinstitutionalized many struggling souls. It was also home to faculty, students, and staff of the seminaries in Hyde Park and the University of Chicago. That meant that on any given Sunday at Augustana, you might be worshiping with Nobel Prize winners and street people. Some of the brightest, most articulate people on the planet, and some who were least able to utter their own thoughts clearly. And so when you went to communion, to receive the bread and wine, the body and blood, you could find yourself rubbing your left shoulder with someone who murmured to himself incoherently and smelled of life in the rough. And your right shoulder could be touching that of a woman who had just won a National Book Award for a novel that spoke volumes to millions. And in that moment, there was no difference among the three of us. We were all one and the same, sinners falling into God's grace, poured in wine and given in bread, body and blood shared for us, being reconciled to God as one people by God's unspeakable love for each of us. So I invite you again, come, share in the bread and wine, shoulder to shoulder, receive God's reconciling mercy as one. Amen.